Welcome back. So we're continuing in chapter 1 in our Principles of Macroeconomics course. And in this video, we're going to start building our sort of main workhorse model, which is called the wage setting, price setting model. As I mentioned, there are other sort of models of the macroeconomy that you might come across, whether that's the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model, or the ISLM model. This one I think is good because it focuses specifically on the labor market and two of the big pieces that we care about in macroeconomics, which are the unemployment rate and the real wage. So let's get started here. And just remember, when we talk about the supply side of the macroeconomy, right, we're talking about producing all of this stuff, all of the goods and services that we produce in an economy, whether that's cars or food or education. All of that goes into the supply side. And then on the other side is the demand side, and that's what we buy. And so when we start talking about GDP, we're going to start talking about how we sort of divide up GDP into its different demand components. So whether that's consumers buying stuff, businesses buying stuff, government buying stuff, or of course, international trade, right? So us buying stuff from other countries and selling stuff to other countries. But for now, we're going to focus on just the supply side. And so for the supply side, there's really sort of two big pieces that we want to talk about, right? So one is the firms. And the firms, of course, are going to hire workers, and those workers are going to work for a wage. They're going to produce goods and services that are going to be sold in the market. And the households are obviously the ones buying it, right? So just remember that circular flow. Remember that one person's spending is another person's income. And so we've got the labor market over here where the firms are hiring workers, and we've got the product market over here where the households are buying the goods and services and the firms are acting as the sellers. So on both sides of these markets, we've got buyers and sellers. It's just that the households are sellers in the labor market and buyers in the product market, and firms are buyers in the product market and sellers in the product market. All right, so let's think about our supply side model. So we're going to have a total amount of output produced. Now, keep in mind, the macroeconomy is very complicated, right? We've got lots of goods and services. We've got millions of people. We've got, thousands and thousands of products. We've got, lots of different wages. We've got lots of different prices. And we're trying to simplify it into sort of one model. And all macroeconomic models, even the most complicated ones, used by the most sophisticated, Federal Reserve Bank economists or private consultant economists or academic economists, are all simplifying things to a huge extent, which makes macroeconomics very difficult. So just keep that in mind as we are building this model. So we're going to have some total amount that is produced. We're going to call that Y. That's going to be GDP, which we'll talk about more in a future chapter. And we'll have some price of output, which is P, right? So we can think of that P not really as a price of one product, but as sort of a weighted price of all the products, right? We've already sort of had one measure of that, which we call the CPI, the Consumer Price Index. That's not the only price index, and in some ways, that's probably not the one we're talking about here. We'll talk about something called the GDP deflator a little bit, but they tend to move together. So when one goes up, the other goes up, and when one goes down, the other goes down. Then we'll have some amount of total employment, which we'll call N, and we'll have some wage, W. Now, of course, in the real world, all of those workers that make up N are different. They have different skills. They work for different companies. They're in different parts of the country, and they're all, earning different wages, W. And so this is, again, sort of a weighted average of everybody's wage that's working. And so how much those workers produce then, on average, is Y over N. And that we can call the average product of labor. And so when we think about the average product of labor, just think about how much stuff are we producing and how much are we working? And we can think about how much are we working, how many, workers are working. That's what we're calling N here. We could also think about like how many hours are those people working if we wanted to be a little more consistent. But that labor productivity is going to be really important because every worker can only be paid a maximum amount of what they produce, right? And so if you're producing, $50 of output per hour that you worked, a firm can never pay you more than $50 an hour, right? And so that's sort of the maximum wage that workers can expect. And of course, they're not going to get that full wage because there's going to be some profit. Now, what we talked about before, right, is that W is being measured in dollars. And so what workers should really care about is how much stuff those dollars can buy. And so what we're going to focus on is the real wage, which we'll call lowercase w. And the real wage is just W in dollars divided by the price level, which is P. And so we get the real wage is the nominal wage divided by the price level. And so that's one of the things that we're going to care about here. All right, so here is our sort of template for our model. So on the horizontal axis, we've got employment. So it's 0 over here on the left, right, on our origin. And we've got the population of working age over here on the right. So we could have more people, right? But those are kids or retirees that we're not interested in. As I said, in the United States, this is the population 16 or over. Now, some people in that working age population are not looking for work, right? They're not in the labor force, and so they are inactive. And so most of the time, we're just going to draw this diagram and stop here at this dotted blue line, which is the labor force. So, all right, so this matches up with our previous video of measuring the macroeconomy, right? We've got our total population, we've got our population of working age, we've got our labor force, and then we can divide up the labor force into the employed plus the unemployed. And so here we've got the employed going from left to right. The unemployed are being measured as this distance. And so often it will be important to remember that if we move from left to right, employed is going up and unemployed is going down. And as we move from right to left, the unemployed is going up and the employed is going down. Okay, what about that vertical axis? On the vertical axis, we're going to have how much are workers producing and then how much are they getting. And so we're going to start up here with output per worker, right, which we just said is Y over N. Total output divided by total workers. And we're going to call that lambda. I don't know why we call it lambda. That's this little Greek letter up here. But that's what we're going to call it. And that's our output per worker. And remember, that number is really important because that is the maximum amount that workers can get paid. If lambda is low, then wages are going to be low. And the only way to increase wages on a sort of macroeconomic scale is for workers to be able to produce more. And that's really the history of the last 250 years is figuring out ways for our workers to be more and more productive, whether that was originally on the farms or in the factories or in offices. Increasing that labor productivity has been what's led to higher wages over the long run. Now, that's the maximum amount a worker can be paid. But in order for a firm to be willing to produce, right, to take the risk of investing in capital, hiring workers, producing a product, selling it, they are going to want to earn some profit. And so that amount then goes to the firm in terms of profit. And so that is lambda minus W. This is, I think, one of the most confusing things about this model is that lambda, for the most part, is fixed, right? At least in the short run. In the long run, it can go up. But in the short run, it's fixed. So we'll just take that as sort of a ceiling. Now, profit then is the distance down to the real wage. So when profit goes down, the real wage actually goes up. And when profit goes up, the real wage goes down, and that lambda is fixed. And so this distance is going to be very important both for the firms, because that's how much profit they're getting, but also for the workers, because everything that goes to the firm as profit is something that they are not getting in terms of the real wage. And so we can measure that real wage up, right, from the origin at 0 up to W, and that's the real wage. And that is what workers are going to get. Now, notice this is a horizontal line, right? So this horizontal line says the employment doesn't matter. In equilibrium, right? In equilibrium, workers are going to get paid W no matter what the employment is. And that makes a certain amount of sense, although we'll talk about sort of what happens in disequilibrium. But in equilibrium, really all that matters is how much can a worker produce, and then how much of that goes to profit. And you take how much the worker is producing. Maybe they're producing $40 an hour worth of stuff, and the firm is getting 25% profit. And so the worker then, which that would be $10. And so then the worker gets paid $30 per hour. And it doesn't matter what the employment rate is. And so that's going to be important when we think about different policies and which ones are more likely to increase wages versus decrease wages. All right, so the way the book sort of motivates this discussion is by thinking about sort of two departments within the firm. So on the sort of human resources side, or HR side, they're trying to figure out, okay, well, how many workers do we need and how much do we have to pay them in order to get them to work effectively? And so that's going to be the wage side. The other is the marketing department. And the marketing department is really what we sort of talked about in microeconomics, right? Is, all right, well, how much should we produce and how much can we charge for that maximizes our profits? And so, it's sometimes in microeconomics, we talk about perfect competition where price is just equal to marginal cost and the firm earns no, economic profit. That's a sort of idealized situation, right? It's not necessarily a realistic situation. Most firms do earn some profit, some economic profit, and they have to, right? Otherwise, they're not going to stay in business. So that's the marketing department's job, is to figure out how much they're producing and what price they are charging. And so when we sort of build our entire model, right, those two things are going to come together, and we'll have one determining the price setting curve and then one determining the wage setting curve, and that will give us our equilibrium, which we will build in our next video.